Hey everyone, I'm Nick, and in this video I'm going to be showing you everything you need to know to make your very own cutting board. Now there's three main types of cutting boards. There's face grain, end grain, and edge grain. In this video we're going to be making an edge grain cutting board. Let's go. Oh, right. So for our cutting board, we're going to be using some cutoffs or some scraps from previous projects that we've saved up. If you don't have scrap wood or cutoffs, you can go purchase wood at your local lumber store or even check with a local wood shop. They may have some scraps that they'll just give you. We're going to be using walnut and maple for our cutting board. A couple things you want to look for when you're selecting the wood for your cutting board is you want a hard wood with a nice tight grain pattern. You want to avoid any woods that have an open grain or a porous grain because food particles can get trapped in there and bacteria will actually grow on your cutting board. So for this project, we're going to need 3 clamps, and they don't need to be 6-foot long clamps. That's just what I have available at the moment. Some wood glue. I like to use Type Bond 3 because it's FDA approved and it's waterproof. Food grade mineral oil, tape measure, our pencil, random orbital sander, trim router, our planer, table saw, and miter saw. Oh, and we might need our wood too. Alright, so let's get started. The trim router and planer can be optional, although they make this project much easier if you have them. So now that we've got all of our scraps picked out, we're going to cut them all to the same length. So now we're going to go over to the table saw and we're going to rip all these to the same width, because when we turn them on their edge, that's going to determine the thickness of our cutting board. Because these are scraps from previous projects, we already have one straight line ripped on every one of these boards. So we just have to take off this side, which is the rough end, as you can see. We're going to set our table saw to 1 3/4 and rip them all to that same size. So the final step before we glue everything up is we're going to run each board through the planer on both sides to flatten them, so when we do glue up, we prevent any gaps. If you don't have a planer, be sure to purchase wood that's already been flattened or planed on both sides. Now that we got all of our pieces cut to the length, the width, and we flatten them all through the planer, we're going to lay out our pattern and the orientation that we want our cutting board. So I've picked out this, we kind of just staggered our colors. Now we're just going to spread everything out and put some glue on them. Now that we've got everything lined up with the glue, we're going to tighten our clamps down. You don't want to go too tight, you just want to tighten them on enough to close these gaps. Just a couple turns on each will do. Get you a little squeeze out going. Squeeze out's when the glue squeezes out of the seams. That's how you know that you got a good spread of glue. So I'm going to put one more clamp on the top. Now we added one more clamp over the middle, and I cleaned up all the excess glue. So we're gonna let this thing sit overnight, and we'll see you tomorrow. All right, so we got her out of the clamps. We let her sit overnight. Now we're gonna run it through the planer on both sides just to smooth out any imperfections on either side. It'll make sanding a lot easier. If you don't have a planer, you can do this just with your sander. It might take a little longer, so you might want to start with like an 80 grit sandpaper and work yourself all the way up to like a 220. But we're gonna run it through this real quick and see what we can do. The last step after the planer or sander, whatever option you chose there, we're coming over to the table saw and we're going to cut the edges to our final length. Now, if you have a table saw with one of these miter gauges, that's all we used here, and I just attached a board here just to even out to cover the span of the cutting board. Some people like to use a cross-cut sled, but this works just as well. So now we're going to take off a little bit on both ends just to even them up. Let's go. now that we have everything trimmed up to size, length, and width, and we ran it through the planer, it's already pretty smooth. So I'm gonna start with a 120 grit, and I'm gonna sand everything down. We're gonna sand with the grain on the top. That reduces your swirling when you're using the sanding pads, and we're also gonna hit the sides and bottom. One thing I did want to mention when you're sanding, there's something called snipe. So if you ran it through the planer, there's going to be a line on the end here where the planer kicks it out. Make sure that you get that out when you're sanding, or else you're going to notice it as soon as you hit that with that oil. Now that we've got our 120 sanded, we're going to take our trim router and hit a round over bit around the entire perimeter. But if you don't have a router, I'm going to show you how to do it with your sander. It's real easy. You just get your sander on the corner and kind of gently rock it back and forth. Not digging too deep, just kind of setting it on there, and I'll show you how real quick. So I wasn't putting any pressure, I was just rounding over that sharp edge right there, and you just do that around the entire thing. Right before we hit our final sand, we're gonna do something called raising the grain. And what that is I'm gonna take a wet rag and wipe down the entire surface. And all that's doing is pulling any fibers that may have got pushed down by the sandpaper in the first round. And it's gonna bring those up, and then we'll hit our final sand and sand it super smooth. As soon as that's dry, we'll come back for our final sand. Now that the water is all dried off, we can feel the grain that's raised up. So I'm gonna swap out my 120 grit for the 220 and do one final sand. Now that we're done with our final sand, the 220 grit, we're gonna get all the dust off before we oil it. We typically apply 3 coats of mineral oil, leaving about 20 minutes of dry time in between each. Now that that final coat of mineral oil is all dry, we're gonna add a thin layer of wax just to help protect and recondition the cutting board. We're gonna wipe it on and then buff it off in about 15 minutes, and this thing will be ready to go. If you use a wax or a reconditioner at home, what's your favorite brand? Leave a comment below to let us know. Also, if you need recommendations on a wax or any other products you've seen in this video, check out our links below. Alright guys, now you have a beautiful cutting board that will last you for years. If you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button so you can join us for all of our weekly builds. So, if you need a link, God dog. Drunk. All right. That we've accumulated over the years. You ready? Okay, so now we're gonna go over to the cut. Now, a couple things you wanna. Okay. Blah 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 blah. All right. So we're gonna be using